Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you again for attending our 5th webinar in our GDPR series. I'm Geert Beekmans, Chief Risk and Security Officer at SD Worx, and I'll be guiding today's webinar with the topic of ensuring compliance of your HR and payroll business partners. Important topic. You can ask questions throughout this webinar using the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will address those towards the end of the webinar. We would like to encourage you also to use the hashtag @GDPR Countdown and the handle @SD Worx on Twitter to give feedback. If you have further questions, you can also contact us at weareglobal@sdworx.com. This live webinar is being recorded and will be sent via email. The presentation and our GDPR International Report are also available for download as with the previous ones. You will also have the opportunity to rate the webinar at the end, which will help us to improve any upcoming sessions and other information. So please do not hesitate to provide your feedback and comments back to us. So that was it in terms of introduction. Let's kick off with the actual webinar. This one is the 5th in the series, so for the coming ones, we'll still have one in May and in June to finish off the series. So please watch out for the future ones as well. In terms of this webinar, I think it's a very important topic. We are all managing typically within HR also a whole ecosystem of business partners that are doing all kinds of stuff for us, from managing payroll to recruitment to whatever HR activities that have been outsourced. And so until now, this ecosystem, there was a lot of flow of data relatively in a free way with little limitations on that one. But with GDPR upcoming now, you will have to take into account a few additional obligations and limitations in terms of that free flow of data if it concerns personal data of your employees, which in an HR context, it will be often the case. So making sure that your business partners, your HR and payroll business partners are compliant and will know very well what is expected of them will be a key activity to ensure your own compliance with GDPR. And now to start with the why and the context on GDPR in general a bit. First of all, maybe a good thing, less good maybe for processors and vendors as we are, but certainly for you as an employer and somebody working with HR service providers, very positive, is that GDPR expands significantly responsibilities of HR suppliers and partners that work as a processor or a subcontractor. In the past, it was the case that you as a data controller were the main responsible and the responsibilities for processes were fairly limited. That changes now, and even if you are not fully doing your own job, we as a processor will have quite some important obligations to take into account and to tackle. Without going into a lot of detail, but the most important ones are instructions of controllers. So controllers are still the ones responsible, and we have to abide your instructions as a processor. The appropriate technical and organizational measures to comply with GDPR. As a processor, you will have to ensure that you take all those measures you need to take to be in compliance with this regulation. Also, at the end of the services, then they have the necessary guarantees that data is deleted or returned. And also a new one, very specific one, is also the conditions for engaging other subcontractors. If we as a processor want to use and engage other subcontractors, there are also very specific conditions that must guarantee that we cannot just do this without your approval. And if we don't, as a processor, we face also a significant enhanced liability for non-compliance, not only the fines which are also directly applicable to us as a processor. If we do not take the necessary measures, we can get fined directly as well. But also for acting outside the authority that you give us as a data controller. So if you as a customer give us certain instructions and controls and we do not follow up or ignore those, we can be considered as a data controller by the data protection authorities if we act outside that authority, with all the consequences that are attached to that one. So that means you as a customer have normally, and as a data controller, should have more guarantees with the existing law, with the GDPR than with the existing law, that your processors are also have a big responsibility and also need to make sure they do their thing. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that you are a bit more off the hook. The burden under GDPR still rests primarily with the employer as a data controller. And you must ensure under GDPR that you only use processes that provide sufficient guarantees to implement the necessary measures. So as an employer, that means you're basically liable for the actions that the HR suppliers you have or you use are taking, and to make sure that they also are compliant with GDPR. That's already the first very important one. Second one as well is that is fairly new and detailed, that GDPR also obliges you to govern that processing with any subcontractor you use into a binding contract. And that contract must meet a number of specific requirements that are stipulated in Article 28.3 of the GDPR. So that means that you will, by law, are obliged to have a good data processing agreement in place with any subcontractor that processes personal data of your employees. So that's a clear change from the past, a lot more specific than it used to be. Even if data processing agreements were in the past already a good way to work and a best practice, it's clearly now a very specific obligation that you will need to manage really well, because it will be one of the first questions if you run into issues with compliancy of suppliers that you will get. Can I have your data processing agreement, and is that okay? Now, some people are a bit creative in some industries also, and consider themselves as a controller as well. Does that mean then they're off the hook? I sometimes get the remark in questions like, we are a data controller, so we don't need a data processing agreement. Yeah, that's a very narrow interpretation. I think, strictly speaking, the law says indeed that between joint controllers, if you are a controller and the other party is a data controller as well, that you need to have an arrangement on the processing of data. It specifically mentions an arrangement and not a contract. So on this level, it means that you can use a contract, of course, but there is a bit more freedom to determine other forms of arrangements, and that has been done on purpose. So some form of joint privacy statement or a joint policy with the other data controller can also maybe demonstrate compliance enough instead of having a formal data processing agreement. It's, however, at present not clear how this will be enforced and accepted. So there's very little guidance on the moment, and the regulators are, to my impression, on purpose quite silent on this aspect. So we will see what this brings to us in the future. If you're wondering, a joint controller, what can that be? Like, for example, a lot of insurance companies, like if you have a group insurance for your employees, they consider themselves a data controller. because they will also have to process insurance data and the data of the people that are under the policy potentially after the employee has left with you as an employer. And so they consider themselves a controller, but that doesn't mean that you are no longer a controller and do not have any responsibility. So we're there in a situation where, for example, with a group insurance company, that you are both joint controllers, and so that you have to make some kind of arrangement to make sure that the processing and the exchange of data you do is in line with GDPR. Doing nothing is as such not an option. So also in those cases, you will need to pay attention that you at least have some minimal agreement and arrangements in place. And last but not least, new under GDPR is also the ability to use a code of conduct and certification as a means to demonstrate compliance. So at various levels and aspects, GDPR introduces two additional mechanisms, being it an approved code of conduct and a certification. And every vendor that has or would comply with such an approved code of conduct or certification would make it a lot easier for you as well as a data controller to demonstrate that your vendors are compliant with the GDPR. Now, at present, the data protection authorities have not yet approved or formally recognized a specific type of certification or a code of conduct. So as of May 25th, there will be a process to send the code of conduct to data protection authorities and to try to get that approved. Certifications, we will probably also see some certifications popping up, for example, like with the big four firms are of course busy with that, and some other firms that are busy with managing certifications are also looking into that, but at the moment there is not yet an officially recognized one. So we cannot yet fully use this mechanism, but I'm pretty convinced that in the near future we will have such mechanisms available. And then, of course, it will be important for suppliers to try to demonstrate compliance or to certify against such available certification. And I think then also as a data controller and you as an employer, you should then be taking that into account in your supplier selection process, and you should definitely also look into your suppliers to certify themselves against that to limit your risk. So that's certainly a useful tool that today doesn't exist in the market and under the present directive, but which will help us a lot in the near future. Now, that is a bit the summary in terms of the legal framework under GDPR and what you should do. So two main points to take into account: the contract, you have to have a binding contract with any subcontractor, and the fact to have sufficient guarantees of your sub-processes. Those are the two main things you should take away from this. Now, if we look at the binding contract, what does that mean? That basically means what is called typically a data processing agreement must be put in place with your subcontractors and vendors. So we'll now dive a bit into more detail on that topic. First of all, I think what needs to be in there in such a data processing agreement, well, it's rather specific. The GDPR now really puts forward in Article 28.3 a limitative list of requirements to which such a data processing agreement must comply. So basically, if you're not able to fulfill compliance with the requirements of that article, your contract will not be fully GDPR ready. And it's a lot more than just a basic statement of confidentiality or a basic statement that you will comply with the applicable privacy regulations. That will not be enough. So I sometimes get questions if, yeah, but we do have a non-disclosure agreement, or there is a clear confidentiality clause in our contract already. Well, that will not meet, definitely not meet the GDPR requirements. What requirements do need to be in there? That's various ones, but I'll just touch on a few ones just to give you an idea. First of all, the categories of personal data that you process and the data subjects that you handle will need to be described. So your agreement will need to list those. You will also have to document the technical and organizational measures that you will apply or that your vendor will apply for securing the information. That can be very high level or that can be very detailed. That depends a bit on you, but of course, the more clear and more extensive it is, the more guarantees you have in the end as a data controller that your subcontractor is doing the necessary things. It will also need to contain conditions for employing subcontractors. So it's also very specific under GDPR. You cannot just employ a subcontractor as a processor without informing your data controller, so you as an employer, and without having an authorization to use such subcontractors. So contracts must foresee the necessary conditions and procedures for that one. Another element will also be the guarantee that data is returned or deleted at the end of the provisioning of the services, and to assist with obligations on breach notification and data protection impact assessments if they are applicable. Now, all those elements, if you just take the ones I've listed here, there are quite a few new obligations in there. There are also references to new obligations under GDPR, which were previously even not in the law, in the directive. So this basically means as well that any previously existing contract will almost be 100% certain not be GDPR compliant. You can take the assumption, in my opinion, that you will have to agree on a new annex and a new data processing agreement that complies with all those requirements. The vast majority or almost every existing contract that has not been adapted for GDPR specifically will not be able or allow you to be compliant with the new regulation. So that means a bit of additional burden. And on that level, I think you also have to look towards your vendors, because if you have selected a good vendor or working with good vendors, they should be able to help you, and they should already have a standardized approach and data processing agreement ready for you. In my opinion, there's often a discussion ongoing like, yeah, do we have to push our own standardized DPA or use that of the vendor? Now, if you have a vendor that has to manage thousands or more clients, he cannot do that based on individual instructions of each of those clients. That's basically in practice impossible to guarantee and still compliance with all of those instructions, not only for managing the variety of the obligations then from every client, but also for translating all these obligations into the contracts with their own subcontractors. Because GDPR also says in that same Article 28 that you as a vendor have to apply the same data protection obligations towards any subcontractors as imposed by the data controller. So, and it literally says the same, so not largely similar obligations. No, it's the same obligations. So if you allow as a vendor, such as we are as well for you, to have man-made, customized data processing agreement that differ from customer to customer, you will never be able in practice to comply with all of those obligations and to translate all those obligations towards your own subcontractors. That's simply impossible. Personally, if I would be you and towards our own vendors that we use as well for our own HR data, I would be alarmed that a vendor just blindly accepts any DPA that we send them from our side, because that means that he's not really managing it in practice. In my opinion, you're likely to only have a paper-based guarantee that he has signed a contract, but it doesn't give you a lot of comfort that he will in practice apply all those obligations as it should be. I would then rather have a conversation on a standardized DPA proposed by your vendor, and if that's really a good DPA, use that one, because it will give you a lot more certainty in the background that he effectively manages those obligations and translates those obligations towards his own subcontractors. But of course, that's always a discussion between the different legal teams. It's also a discussion on workload. So that's part of the new obligations. Now, within SD Worx, we have done a lot of effort on that level, and we have tried to, as maximally possible, to solve your data processing agreement problem as a customer, and have developed our own data processing agreement statement, of course. As a customer, normally you should have already received a request to sign this new agreement or to agree with the new terms and conditions on that level. If not, I think it's certainly useful to contact your account manager if there's something wrong there, or if you maybe have the wrong contact person, because normally you should have had that information. And we are really convinced that this agreement will provide you really with a lot of guarantees to ensure your compliance with GDPR for all the services we deliver to you as a service provider. The terms have been reviewed by independent legal experts and firms. We have used them in the past year quite extensively and had still very good feedback on those. And it will guarantee, as a customer, your compliance with all the GDPR requirements that are listed in Article 28.3. So we can guarantee you there that the contract is fully compliant with that one. And more on top of that, we have not just put the purely only legal obligations that must be in the contract, but we've tried to provide as much as transparent information also possible on how we will process your information, which technical and organizational measures we will implement and apply, what type of data we process. We've tried there to be as transparent and extensive as possible. So it's really a strong commitment from SD Worx side towards the customers, I think. And also it's translated into a back-to-back agreement with all the partners we use and subcontractors we use as SD Worx. So signing this agreement really guarantees you that not only we, but also all partners that we use are living up to the same obligations under the agreement, and gives you as such a strong commitment that all the services are there covered and fully GDPR compliant. Now, it's easy to have such a contract template or statement, but implementing it is still quite a bit of challenges involved. First of all, main question there is, do you already have an alternative list of vendors and have a clear overview of your HR partners? Who are they? Do they process personal data or not? Have we signed already a contract or not? And what is in there? Who is responsible for that vendor in particular? That's already the first question, and I often see that it's already a challenge to have a good guarantee on the completeness and the adequacy of that list. So that's the first step. Without that list, it's already difficult to take it to a signed contract. Also, there are a lot of differences in the maturities of vendors, and once you send out your DPA, you will notice or request to have a DPA signed. You will notice, depending on the response from the vendor, how ready and knowledgeable they are on this topic already. Do they understand the importance of it? Will they have good technical and organizational measures and be able to explain those to you? You will immediately notice that there will not always be that easy to agree upon those and to obtain those. But if you have a good professional vendor that's busy with GDPR, they should be able to do that. Then there's the contract management part and getting that whole contract signed, amended where needed, signed the agreement. But then also afterwards, you will have to store that, archive that, keep that, and make sure it's kept up to date and relevant towards the services that are delivered towards you. So there's a whole contract management part on that one, and it will also take significant effort. It will depend on how mature your contract management part is, how fluently that goes. But I often see that also as a challenge. And then there is still the whole vendor management part. If you select new vendors, then this contract management part and the whole question of having sufficient guarantees on the measures your vendors take should be part of your vendor management process. So it should be in your selection and onboarding process for a new vendor within your HR department as a standard. So it's not a one-off, not just have everything signed now and we're done. No, you will still also have to ensure that that becomes a continuous process. So that in terms of the overall data processing agreement challenges, is that enough? No, not always, because in addition to having the obligation to have a binding contract, the GDPR also says that you need to obtain sufficient guarantees for the measures your vendors take. Now, the contract is, of course, the first one, and it is already, if you have an extensive contract that clearly describes the technical and organizational measures and any other controls around that, then you definitely will have already a lot of a good basis, a strong basis to provide those guarantees, but there not will be always be sufficient. And there are other things you can look at as well from that perspective. First of all, I think it's also important, as I said, to take it into account into selection and use only strong partners that can ensure that they are compliant with your GDPR requirements. So that's a balance between both risk and opportunity, because on the one hand, as we explained, you're liable as a data controller and as an employer for your HR data, that the HR vendors you use do the necessary thing to get compliant. On the other hand, if you have really good, strong HR and payroll business partners with the necessary controls, with a good data processing agreement, etc., they can take away a part of your burden in getting compliance, and they can ensure you that you are able as an employer to manage that compliancy with GDPR. So therefore, I only have one strong advice. Please make sure you select and choose really good HR, payroll, and business partners that are able to comply and provide you with all the guarantees you need. And of course, we are willing as SD Worx to provide you with further information on that and to ensure that we are also can demonstrate that we fully comply with everything that you should comply with. In terms of certification and attestations, therefore, it's not because I said in the beginning there's not yet a recognized certification or attestation by the data protection authorities that this cannot provide you with the necessary guarantees or added value. Today, we already have quite a few certifications that exist in the marketplace. I've listed a few of those, such as an IZ 3402 or SOC 1 certification or a SOC 2 certification. And there is also the ISO 27001 standard on information security management. So vendors that are certified against one of those will definitely, if they can provide you with those certificates, be able to provide you with more stronger guarantees and can give you more comfort in how they're handling your data. So one of the questions I would definitely ask your vendors is, do they have such a certification? And if so, which one? And can they provide a copy of that one to you? That I would definitely put into your processes. Within SD Worx, we have such type of certifications. So we use already for years the ISAE 3402 certification, which is an international standard that has a recognized audit firm certifying your internal controls. And as part of the controls in our report, we also take into account the physical and logical security measures we take to protect the data. So those are part of our scope of our ISAE 34 report and are audited on a yearly basis. In our case by Deloitte, and there are certificates or yearly audit reports available towards our customers to certify on that one. So upon request, we can certainly deliver you with a copy of a statement delivered by Deloitte that we have the necessary measures in place. Also, we are using ISO 27001 as an overall framework, and our UK, Ireland, and Mauritius practices have already gone through a formal certification on those ones. So that's even more guarantees towards you as a customer that on top of the ISAE controls, there is also a whole security management system in place and certified, which give you a lot of guarantees towards GDPR as well, that the technical and organizational measures are in place. So that concerning SD Worx. Now, should you have vendors that are not yet have those certifications, or you are not sure if all measures are sufficiently up to standard, then you could also use a self-assessment questionnaire as a fallback mechanism. That self-assessment questionnaire is typically a questionnaire that is sent towards the vendor, in which you ask him to complete a number of questions that will evaluate his maturity on technical and organizational measures. It's a good alternative, I think, if no certification is available or other supporting information. But if a good certification is available, that normally should cover all the necessary questions. So it's rather on top of, or for those vendors that are really critical to have it. I would check then, therefore first, it can be quite specific towards security and privacy measures. So I check first with your information security department or your purchasing department if within your company you have such a checklist available. And if you then could use that towards any vendors that cannot provide you with the necessary certification or sufficient guarantees. I would also focus on the critical suppliers here. I see sometimes a lot of organizations that just use that checklist to forward that towards all of their vendors without any difference, without any logic. I would not do that. I would try to take a risk-based approach there from your side as well, because the questionnaires to follow up on the questionnaires is also a lot of effort to get that back. Also a lot of effort from your vendors. So you have to be reasonable there, and it has to be useful as well. So focus on those ones that are really critical to your operations. And also do not forget the follow-up and review of those questionnaires afterwards. It doesn't stop with sending the questionnaire and getting the answer back. If a vendor fills that in, you will need to review their answers, and you will need to follow up potential outstanding actions where they have an issue or where they're not fully in line with what you would expect. So it will trigger additional work. I'm not a big fan of using such checklists just as a check and compliance box. I sometimes get those questions and I never hear something back. It's rather indicates that it's more used as a checking the box mechanism as, yep, it's completed, but that it's not really followed up and that you're not really looking at the measures that the vendor mentions and uses. So that's also important. But if your vendors have additional other supporting documentation or certification, then I would certainly refer to that. So please stay reasonable also on that level. As a vendor, we get a lot of those questionnaires these days, and we're not able to respond to every single one of them, tailored to every single customer. That's why those certifications and additional standard information that we have developed are available and should provide you with sufficient guarantees on that level. So that brings us to the end of this this webinar in total. So what to take with this from is mainly obtaining sufficient guarantees, look at the certifications, and potentially use the questionnaire. And secondly, absolutely make sure that you have a solid, rock solid data processing agreement in place with your HR vendors and partners that you use, and that you verify that one. Now I'll be ready to take any further questions and comments from your side you should have on this topic. So please go ahead with the Q&A, and you can put the questions on the right hand side in the box where these are available. First question I have here is a data processing agreement enough to obtain sufficient guarantees? Well, as I said during the webinar, I think the process of having a DPA signed, and a very good DPA signed, will give you already a lot of assurance. And certainly if it's an extensive one with the necessary guarantees, you will get quite far in having the necessary guarantees. But is it sufficient? Not always. You will also have to look into the indications that is my vendor mature enough? Do I have sufficient information on all aspects? And if there are indications that it's not the case, you will have to follow up on those. As I said in the last remark, if you get answers back that are not okay or not fully okay, you will have the responsibility as a data controller to take action and to follow up on those actions. So just having the contract written without any further ado and without any further checks in practice is in my opinion, not 100% enough for the critical vendors you have. Secondly, Article 40 to 43, who will certify Indian companies who process Europe data that they comply with GDPR? Very good question. In terms of certification, it's still open. So what is in the GDPR law is that the data protection authorities will have the power to assign and to recognize certification bodies that are authorized to issue certificates or a particular certification that ascertains that you're compliant with GDPR. But at the moment, this is still new, so all the data protection authorities are still busy with that process, I think. And as of the 25th of May, you will be able to, I think, to apply for as a certification body to issue certificate that assures that the company is compliant with the GDPR. But they're not there yet. So I hope personally that there will be soon a number of certification bodies that will get recognized by the data protection authorities in Europe to issue certificates. And that there is also types of certificates that will be recognized. From the moment we have one on that level, then you could use those certification bodies to ask for a certificate audit and a certification process. But so that will still be a process that the coming year it will be very interesting to watch. And of course, I don't think there will be a difference between an Indian company or a European company in terms of that process. You will probably have to go through the same checks and the same processes to obtain that certification. The only aspect that will play an additional role is that you will have to comply with the requirements on international data transfers outside the EU and have to make sure that you have those on order. So that will be the main focus for I think for non-EU providers, but for the rest, I think you will be able to use the same certification bodies. I would expect so, but we'll see once we have a first certification body that has been approved and ready by the authorities. I also see a question on SD Worx with regard to our own setup. So we indeed also have operations and partners outside Europe. Where possible, we will definitely try to obtain certification once it's there. For the moment, we have translated our own data processing agreement and the obligations that we commit ourselves towards our customers, also towards all our partners, and that includes also our non-European partners, as well as our own office within Mauritius. So we have an offshore center in Mauritius within SD Worx ourselves, and we also guarantee compliance on that level with GDPR. So there are contracts there in place, and yeah, they should be able to provide you with enough guarantees on that level. And our own data processing agreement also covers any processing outside the EU. So that you have a rock solid guarantee that in case for the services that we deliver to you, there should be any processing outside the EU necessary, then that you are sure that this is done in a fully compliant way. Then there's a question what SD Worx is still planning to do on certification itself. Well, as I mentioned, we have our current ISAE certification, and we're still awaiting a bit the further guidance of the data protection authorities on what future certification will be recognized. But we're also already looking into if we could potentially also use our ISAE certification further on to guarantee compliance. As I mentioned, the logical and physical access controls are certainly already in the scope of our ISAE certification, and will provide you as a customer with the necessary guarantees on that level. And we will see if we can further expand that one with other GDPR controls, or if we go to a dedicated GDPR certification. But we will follow that up closely, and once there is something there, we will definitely move into that direction quickly. There's still a question on qualification of data processor and data controller. I think on this level, the controller is definitely, you as an employer are definitely a controller. Should there be still any doubt with any of you as an HR, as an employer employing personnel, you're processing data of your employees, and you're deciding on how to manage that data and with whom you work together to process that data. So you're definitely the data controller on that level. The only question is with the vendors you work with, are they acting as a joint controller or are they a processor for your operations? Typically with the services that are delivered by SD Worx, we will operate and function as a processor, where you will still be in the lead as a data controller. For some cases, like the example I gave with the insurance companies, with the group insurance, there might be that you're in a situation with joint data controllers and where you have to make arrangements with that party. So it will depend, depending on the situation, but I think in the majority of the cases within an HR context, it will typically be the employer be the data controller and the vendor will be the processor. In some exceptional cases, it might be a situation of joint controllers, but that's certainly not the overall legal situation. Okay, I think that was it in terms of further questions. I do not see any further questions popping up, so I assume that was all clear then. Should you have any further questions, then certainly don't hesitate to still forward those or email us directly on those towards weareglobal@sdworx.com. For the rest, I would thank you very much for joining this webinar. We will put the webinar available also to be viewed again on the website for download. And please stay tuned for our next webinar series, which will be a very interesting one as well. We aim to guide you further afterwards as well. So we're almost in the D-Day in May, but that doesn't stop us from providing further information and further preparing GDPR compliance with you. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you next time. Bye-bye.